It's not natural to kill people. And when you do it, and when you see it, when you experience it, it never leaves you. It's stuck in your head. And fortunately, most people are able to compartmentalize it and say, okay, that's rattling around in there, but I'm gonna do my best to keep on going. But some people can't, and it changes them. If you go to war, you're broken forever. Some people are broken a little bit, some people are broken totally, but you're broken, and we need to understand that all these nice, healthy young men and women who could be such an important part of our society, when we send them to war, they break. When they come back, they're broken. And then it's society's obligation to fix them, but we can't fix them. You can't. All you can do is, is bind their wounds and hope that the scars aren't too deep, aren't too crippling. But it just bothers me when I see people out there promoting the continuation of this conflict, the expansion of this conflict, as if this is a good thing. It's not a good thing. This war should never have been fought. The Russians put a peace proposal on the table in December of 2021. West said no. See, the West only dictates outcomes. They never negotiate solutions.
As Mr. Scott Ritter has repeatedly pointed out, the dynamics of modern warfare have shifted dramatically. In the past 24 hours, as we meticulously track the unfolding events in the war, it becomes increasingly clear that this conflict has entered a new phase, one defined not by rapid advances or decisive battles, but by a slow, grinding war of attrition. This is not a war measured by territorial gains, but by the depletion of enemy resources, the weakening of morale, and the gradual erosion of strength. Kursk stands as the latest chapter in this long, slow campaign. And as we examine the battlefield, it becomes evident that what Ukraine may perceive as progress is nothing more than a fleeting mirage, a reflection of last year's disastrous campaign in Zaporizhzhia. Last year, we watched as Ukraine boldly declared its intentions to cut off Russian supply lines, march into Crimea, and sever the connection between Zaporizhzhia and the Russian Federation. But for all their bluster, what did they achieve? In the first 10 kilometers of that offensive, Ukrainian forces suffered massive casualties, thousands of lives lost in a doomed push that failed to break the Russian lines. Today, we see the same story playing out in Kursk, with the Ukrainian command overestimating their capabilities and underestimating Russia's unyielding defenses. In their pursuit of glory, they have forgotten the true cost of war, cost they continue to pay in blood and broken equipment. And yet, as we delve deeper, the lessons of history are ignored, and the reality on the ground remains grim for Ukraine. Inspector Scott Ritter has long analyzed the futility of attritional warfare, particularly when one side is overconfident. To truly understand the futility of Ukraine's current offensive in Kursk, we must reflect on their previous failures. In Robotyne, the initial thrust seemed promising. The Ukrainians advanced swiftly through the first few kilometers, and their media and political machines celebrated every small gain as if it were the beginning of a grand campaign. But what happened next? After advancing just 10 kilometers, they encountered fierce resistance from Russian forces who had dug in deep and prepared for a war of endurance. The reality was brutal. For every meter gained, Ukrainian forces suffered enormous losses. Thousands of soldiers perished in a matter of weeks, and their momentum quickly stalled. What was hailed as a breakthrough turned into a grinding battle of attrition, with Ukraine losing ground almost as quickly as they had gained it. Today, we see the same pattern in Kursk. Ukrainian forces have made some small gains, but they are advancing into a trap once set by Russian forces who have learned from their own experiences and adapted their strategies accordingly. In Kursk, Ukrainian forces have already lost over 400 vehicles, and the estimated death toll ranges between 4,000 and 5,000, numbers that continue to climb daily. And just as in Robotyne, these losses will soon eclipse whatever minor gains they have made. Ukrainian commanders may hope for a breakthrough, but the reality is that they are simply feeding their best troops into a meat grinder with little to show for it. Yet, as the Kursk offensive drags on, we must turn our attention to the larger implications of Ukraine's losses, not just on the battlefield, but on the home front as well. In his latest assessment, Inspector Scott Ritter emphasized the significance of territorial control in modern conflicts. One of the most significant developments in the Kursk offensive has been the brief Ukrainian seizure of Sudzha. It was, by all accounts, a sudden and unexpected advance, one that caught Russian forces off guard. But even this momentary victory was short-lived. Within a day, Russian troops regrouped, cut off Ukrainian supply lines, and surrounded the remaining forces. Sudzha is now little more than a symbol of Ukraine's fleeting success, a town that may have fallen for a moment but remains firmly under Russian control. These short-lived victories reveal the larger truth of this conflict. Ukraine may have moments of success, but they lack the ability to sustain them. Russian forces have perfected the art of elastic defense, pulling back when necessary, only to strike back with devastating force when the moment is right. Kursk is no different. Despite Ukraine's initial gains, their offensive is faltering and they are now on the defensive in many areas. As we look ahead, it is clear that Ukraine's chances of making any significant breakthroughs in Kursk are slim. Their forces are overstretched, their equipment is depleted, and their morale is wavering. And yet, despite these setbacks, they continue to push forward, hoping for a victory that seems increasingly out of reach. But the consequences of these failed offensives are not just military, they are political as well. As we turn our attention to Kyiv and the desperation now gripping Ukraine's leadership. As highlighted by Inspector Scott Ritter, the lack of proper military training has dire consequences on the battlefield. Yesterday, the Associated Press released a damning report on the state of Ukraine's armed forces. The report revealed that many of the soldiers now being sent to the front lines have received little to no training, conscripts pulled from the streets and thrust into battle with minimal preparation. It is no wonder that these troops are struggling to hold their ground. They are not just fighting against a well-equipped and experienced Russian military, they are fighting against their own lack of preparation. According to Ukrainian commanders, many of these conscripts have never even fired a weapon in combat. They are sent into the trenches with outdated rifles, insufficient ammunition, and little more than a hope for survival. One commander of Ukraine's famed 47th Brigade lamented that his troops were so ill-prepared that they could barely distinguish between friend and foe on the battlefield. These untrained soldiers are not just a liability, they are a ticking time bomb. Their lack of experience leads to fear and panic, and this panic spreads through the ranks like wildfire, leaving entire units in disarray. This chaos on the front lines is a direct result of Ukraine's inability to properly train and equip its forces, something that is becoming increasingly difficult as the war drags on. But the cracks in Ukraine's military strategy are only part of the story. As we shift our focus to Kyiv, we see a government struggling to maintain control amidst a growing tide of desperation. Reflecting on the insights of Inspector Scott Ritter, one can see how desperation often leads to poor decision-making in wartime. In Kyiv, the desperation is palpable. Reports from the Kyiv Independent suggest that the Ukrainian government is laying the groundwork for potential peace talks with Russia this fall, a move that reflects just how dire their situation has become. President Zelensky, once defiant in his refusal to negotiate, now finds himself cornered with few options left on the table. But while Kyiv may be eager to negotiate, Moscow has made its position abundantly clear: there will be no negotiations, no concessions, and no forgiveness for Ukraine's attacks on Russian soil. This is not just a military conflict, it is a battle for national pride, and Russia has no intention of backing down. Zelensky may hope for a diplomatic solution, but the reality is that Ukraine's position is weakening by the day, and their bargaining power is rapidly diminishing. As we move forward, it is important to consider how the international community is reacting to Ukraine's struggles and what the future holds for both sides in this ongoing conflict. Even Inspector Scott Ritter has questioned the effectiveness of Western support in sustaining Ukraine's war effort. Despite the billions of dollars in aid that Ukraine has received from the West, the cracks in their military capabilities are growing wider. Bloomberg recently reported that even with continuous support from the United States and Europe, Ukraine's ability to match Russia's military production is woefully inadequate. For every shipment of Western arms that arrives in Ukraine, Russia continues to churn out tanks, artillery, and missiles at a pace that Ukraine simply cannot match. Ukraine's reliance on Western aid has placed them in a precarious position. While they can sustain defensive operations for the time being, their ability to launch successful offensives is rapidly diminishing. Without a significant increase in resources, Ukraine's window of opportunity is closing fast. And as the Kursk offensive drags on, it becomes increasingly likely that Ukraine will be forced to shift its focus from offense to defense, an admission that their current strategy has failed. For now, Russia continues to execute its strategy of attrition, draining Ukraine of its resources, manpower, and morale. The future of Kursk and the war itself will be determined not by who can strike the hardest, but by who can endure the longest. And in this slow war, Russia holds the advantage. As we bring our analysis to a close, let us reflect on the broader implications of this war and what it means for the future of Ukraine and the international community. As Inspector Scott Ritter has aptly noted, the war of attrition is a battle of wills as much as it is a battle of arms. Kursk, like Roboting before it, stands as a testament to the failures of Ukraine's military strategy. The slow war that Russia wages may not capture headlines with flashy victories, but it is a war of endurance, one that will ultimately decide the fate of this conflict. Attrition, the slow wearing down of enemy forces, is not just a strategy for Russia, it is the key to their success. And as Ukraine's resources dwindle and their forces crumble, it becomes ever clearer that this war will be won not by those who fight the hardest, but by those who can endure the longest. Thank you for joining us as we continue to cover this evolving conflict. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and we will be here to provide you with the latest updates as the situation unfolds. Until then, remember the slow war may be less dramatic, but its consequences are far more enduring.